A little boy in tears stops a billionaire CEO and says, "Hey sir, my mom told me what you did to us." The man freezes, shocked by the accusation. Victor Crane stepped out of his sleek, black car, the cool evening air brushing against his tailored suit. The hum of chatter and soft piano music flowed from the entrance of the grand ballroom, where tonight's charity gala was in full swing. His driver closed the door behind him as Victor adjusted the cufflinks on his pristine white shirt, his sharp gaze sweeping over the red carpet leading to the event. The world knew Victor as a titan of industry, a man who had clawed his way to the top with unrelenting ambition. Tonight he was the star donor for a charity supporting underprivileged children, a convenient way to boost his public image while reducing his tax burden. The media loved stories of powerful men doing good, and Victor had learned to play the game well. He was halfway to the entrance when he felt a small tug on his sleeve. Turning, he looked down to see a boy, no older than 9, with messy brown hair and tear-streaked cheeks. The boy's small hand gripped the edge of Victor's suit jacket tightly, his wide eyes red and puffy. "Hey, sir," the boy said, his voice trembling but loud enough to cut through the ambient noise. "My mom told me what you did to us." Victor frowned, momentarily stunned. "Excuse me?" he said, his tone sharp, but the boy didn't flinch. "You!" the boy exclaimed, his voice rising with each word. "You made my dad's company go away! You made us lose everything!" His voice cracked on the last word, and fresh tears spilled down his cheeks. A wave of discomfort rolled over Victor. He glanced around, conscious of the eyes beginning to turn in their direction. Nearby attendees murmured softly, curious but hesitant to intervene. He crouched slightly, bringing himself closer to the boy's eye level, his polished demeanor faltering. "Listen, kid," Victor said in a hushed tone, trying to sound patient. "I don't know who you are or what you're talking about, but you do know," the boy interrupted, his voice breaking again. "My dad said it was your lawyers. You made us lose our house. We're getting kicked out, and it's all your fault." His words were a torrent of anger and heartbreak, unfiltered and piercing. Victor's jaw tightened. He had dealt with his fair share of angry protesters, disgruntled employees, and rivals, but never a crying child accusing him in public. He opened his mouth to respond, to deflect, but the boy's tearful gaze stopped him cold. The boy let go of Victor's sleeve and wiped his face with the back of his hand. "My mom said you only care about money. That you don't care about people like us." His voice grew softer but no less devastating. "Why don't you care about us?" Victor straightened, towering over the boy, and took a step back. The words hit harder than he wanted to admit, each syllable tearing at the carefully constructed wall of confidence he carried. "I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding," Victor said stiffly, regaining some of his composure. He turned to look for security, but the boy's small voice stopped him again. "No misunderstanding," the boy muttered. "We're losing everything because of you." Victor looked back at him, his irritation now mixed with an unfamiliar pang of guilt. He didn't recognize the boy, but something about his face, a mix of determination and vulnerability, stirred something buried deep. A woman's voice cut through the tension. "Ethan!" Victor turned to see a woman rushing toward them, her face pale and eyes wide with a mix of panic and embarrassment. She reached the boy in moments, placing her hands on his shoulders and pulling him back protectively. "I'm so sorry," she said quickly, looking up at Victor with a strained expression. "He doesn't know what he's saying. Please forgive him." Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke, and Victor noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the tightness of her lips. "Mom, it's him," Ethan insisted, looking up at her. "It's the guy Dad told us about." "That's enough," she whispered harshly, her voice barely concealing the crack of emotion. She turned to Victor again, forcing a polite smile. "I'm sorry to have disturbed you, Mr. Crane. We'll leave now." Victor wanted to wave them off, to forget the strange interaction and walk into the gala as if nothing had happened. But he found himself staring at the woman, noting the exhaustion etched into her features. She looked as though she hadn't slept in days. "It's fine," Victor said, his voice more subdued than he intended. He watched as the woman gently guided Ethan away, her hand trembling slightly as she held his arm. Ethan glanced back over his shoulder, his tear-filled eyes meeting Victor's one last time. "You're a bad person," he said, his voice shaking but resolute. "You made my dad cry." Victor stood frozen as they disappeared into the crowd. The chatter of the gala-goers faded into the background, replaced by the boy's words echoing in his mind. "You're a bad person." He took a deep breath and adjusted his cufflinks again, but his hands felt clumsy. His usually unshakable confidence wavered as he turned toward the ballroom, where photographers and reporters waited to capture the image of the generous billionaire philanthropist. But as Victor walked forward, the weight of the boy's words clung to him like a shadow. For the first time in years, he felt the faint stirrings of doubt, not about his success, but about the cost of achieving it. Victor moved through the grand entrance of the gala, the polished marble floor gleaming beneath the soft glow of chandeliers. Cameras flashed, capturing his every move as he exchanged practiced smiles and handshakes. Yet, for the first time in years, he felt disconnected from the carefully curated image of himself that he projected to the world. The boy's words played on a loop in his mind. "You made my dad cry." It was absurd, he thought, allowing himself to be rattled by a child's emotional outburst. Business was business. It wasn't personal. Yet, something about the raw pain in that boy's voice had burrowed under his skin. He couldn't shake the image of those tear-filled eyes staring up at him, accusing him of something he had likely long forgotten. Victor's champagne flute remained untouched as he made his way through the evening. The speeches, the applause, the light banter, it all blurred into a dull hum. His mind wandered, tugged by memories he hadn't revisited in years. Michael Parker. The name surfaced like a jagged rock in still water. Victor didn't remember the man's face, but he vividly remembered Parker Innovations. A small but ambitious tech firm, it had entered the same market as one of Victor's ventures several years ago. The competition had been fierce, and Victor had known from the beginning that there wasn't room for both companies to thrive. He leaned against the edge of a balcony, the cold night air biting at his face. Closing his eyes, Victor let the memory unfold. Parker Innovations had been gaining momentum, led by Michael Parker's innovative approach and enthusiastic charm. Investors were starting to take notice. Victor had watched from the sidelines, recognizing the threat. He hadn't built his empire by being passive. His legal team had been relentless. They dug into every detail of Parker Innovations, scouring for vulnerabilities. When they found a patent dispute, a minor technicality that most firms would have overlooked, Victor seized the opportunity. The lawsuit had been swift, his lawyers overwhelming Parker's smaller legal team with resources and expertise. Victor remembered sitting in his boardroom, reviewing the updates from his legal counsel. "It's only a matter of time," one of them had said, smiling confidently. And it had been. Parker Innovations didn't stand a chance. When the ruling came down in Victor's favor, he had barely blinked. Another victory. Another rival neutralized. His company absorbed Parker's market share, and the incident was filed away in the endless string of battles that defined his career. But tonight those details felt heavier. The boy's voice, the mother's weary face, they gave a human dimension to what Victor had always treated as strategy and numbers. He wondered, for the first time, what had happened to Michael Parker after the lawsuit. How had the man's life unraveled? Victor shook his head, exhaling sharply. He straightened his posture, brushing off the unease that had settled over him. "It's just business," he muttered under his breath, as if saying it aloud would make it feel true again. He had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to second-guess himself now. The corporate world wasn't a place for sentimentality. You won, or you were eaten alive. And yet, the boy's accusation lingered. Victor returned to his car after the gala, slipping into the back seat without acknowledging the driver. He leaned back, staring out at the city lights streaking past the window. The flashbacks continued. He recalled Michael Parker's face after the final ruling, a mix of disbelief and defeat. Parker had tried to fight back, but he'd been outmatched at every turn. Victor had barely glanced at the man during those courtroom appearances, treating him as nothing more than an obstacle to be overcome. He thought of Rachel Parker, her trembling hands as she pulled her son away. Had she been there back then, supporting her husband in court? Victor hadn't cared enough to notice. To him, they had been just another small family-owned business crushed under the weight of his ambition. Victor tried to convince himself that he wasn't responsible for their current plight. The lawsuit had been fair. He hadn't forced Parker to start a competing business. He hadn't told the man to invest his life savings into a venture that couldn't survive the cutthroat realities of the market. It wasn't Victor's fault if the family had lost their home or their stability. Still, the boy's words cut deeper than they should have. Ethan Parker wasn't supposed to exist in Victor's world. Children like him were an abstraction, a statistic in the balance sheets that measured success. His thoughts wandered to the night he had signed off on the lawsuit strategy. He had celebrated with his legal team afterward, popping open an expensive bottle of champagne to toast another victory. At the time, it had felt like just another step toward solidifying his empire. Now, the memory left a bitter taste in his mouth. Victor's car pulled into the underground garage of his luxury penthouse. The driver opened the door for him, but Victor lingered in the back seat for a moment, staring at his reflection in the window. The man who stared back at him looked every bit the part of a successful CEO, sharp, polished, untouchable. But there was something hollow in his eyes. He climbed out of the car and rode the elevator up to his penthouse, the silence of the space oppressive. The lights came on automatically as he entered, illuminating the modern decor and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. Yet, tonight, it all felt suffocating. Victor walked over to his desk, pulling out his tablet. With a few quick searches, he found an article about Parker Innovation's downfall. The headline read, "David vs. Goliath: How a Small Tech Firm Was Crushed by Corporate Giant Crane Technologies." The article detailed the timeline of events, painting Parker as an underdog who had tried to challenge an industry titan. There was a photo of Michael Parker included, a man with kind eyes and a tired smile. Beside him stood Rachel, holding a much younger Ethan. They had looked happy once, full of hope and determination. Victor closed the tablet and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Ethan's tearful face filled his mind again, this time accompanied by Michael's haunted expression after the court ruling. For years, Victor had told himself that his actions were necessary, that they were the price of success. But tonight, for the first time, he wondered if he had been wrong. Victor couldn't sleep. The city lights painted shifting patterns on the ceiling of his penthouse, but they offered no solace. He kept thinking about the Parker family. The boy's words lingered like a splinter in his mind, and Michael Parker's face from that old photo haunted him. How had they ended up like this? He had told himself the lawsuit was just business, but the weight of their apparent suffering made his usual justifications feel hollow. Far from Victor's luxurious penthouse, the Parker family's small rented house was cloaked in darkness, save for the faint glow of a lamp in the living room. Rachel Parker sat at the kitchen table, her head in her hands, staring at a stack of bills and an eviction notice. She had worked a double shift earlier, delivering groceries, but it still wasn't enough. In the next room, Michael Parker sat slumped on the couch, staring blankly at the television. The screen flickered with an old sitcom, the laughter track grating against the heavy silence between them. Michael hadn't been the same since losing the company. Rachel glanced up and saw him sitting there, unshaven and wearing the same shirt he'd had on for 3 days. Her frustration bubbled up, and she couldn't hold it in any longer. "Are you just going to sit there all night?" she asked sharply, her voice breaking the stillness. Michael flinched but didn't turn to look at her. "What do you want me to do, Rachel?" he muttered. "I've tried everything. No one's hiring me. They see my name and think, oh, isn't he the guy who lost to Crane Technologies?" Rachel stood, her chair scraping against the floor. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't feel it every day when I'm out there busting my ass trying to make ends meet?" Her voice rose, and she gestured toward the bills on the table. "But we have a kid, Michael. We can't just give up." Michael turned off the TV and finally faced her. His eyes were bloodshot, filled with a mix of anger and despair. "I didn't give up, Rachel. I fought for years to build that company. I worked harder than I ever thought I could, and it still wasn't enough. Crane crushed us. He crushed me. What am I supposed to do now? Pretend like I can fix this?" Rachel shook her head, tears forming in her eyes. "You don't have to fix everything, Michael. But you can't just sit there and let this defeat you. Ethan needs his father." Her voice cracked on Ethan's name, and she turned away, biting her lip to hold back a sob. Michael looked down, ashamed but still trapped in the web of his own guilt. He opened his mouth to respond, but a small voice from the hallway interrupted them. "Stop fighting," Ethan said, standing in the doorway in his pajamas. His eyes were wide and sad, his small frame illuminated by the dim kitchen light. Rachel wiped her face quickly and forced a smile. "We're not fighting, sweetheart. Just talking." Ethan didn't look convinced. "Is it because of that man? The one who made us lose the company?" Michael froze, his face hardening. Rachel hesitated, then knelt down to Ethan's level. "It's complicated, honey. Grown-up stuff. But he's the reason we're losing the house, right?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. Neither parent answered, but their silence was enough. Ethan's small fists clenched at his sides. "It's not fair," he said. "Why can he have everything and we lose everything?" Rachel reached for him, but Ethan stepped back. "It's not fair," he repeated, tears streaming down his cheeks. Then he turned and ran back to his room, slamming the door behind him. Rachel sighed, her shoulders slumping. Michael stood and walked to the kitchen, leaning against the counter. "He's just a kid," Michael said quietly. "He doesn't understand." Rachel gave him a tired look. "Maybe he understands more than we think." In his room, Ethan lay on his bed, clutching his worn stuffed dinosaur. He thought about the arguments he'd overheard over the past year, about his dad losing the company and the house. He thought about the charity gala he'd seen on TV, where they talked about a man named Victor Crane. His mom hadn't meant for him to hear her complaints about Crane or the lawsuit, but he had listened anyway. Now he knew who was to blame. Ethan didn't fall asleep that night. Instead, he made up his mind. If no one else could stop Victor Crane, maybe he could. The next morning, Rachel left early for her first shift at a diner, and Michael stayed in bed. Ethan ate his cereal quietly, formulating a plan. He had heard his mom mention the gala the night before. She'd said something about Crane showing up to look good for the cameras. Ethan didn't know where it was, but he figured it couldn't be far. When Rachel came home between shifts, Ethan pretended to play in the yard while she napped. Then, as the afternoon faded into evening, he slipped out of the house. He walked farther than he ever had before, the streets growing busier as he neared the nicer part of town. His small legs ached, but he didn't stop. When he finally saw the brightly lit entrance to the gala, he knew he was in the right place. Victor Crane was easy to spot. Ethan recognized him from the news. The man looked larger than life, stepping out of a fancy car surrounded by people in expensive clothes. For a moment, Ethan felt small and scared, but he clenched his fists and pushed forward. When he finally reached Victor and tugged on his sleeve, the words came tumbling out before he could stop them. "Hey, sir, my mom told me what you did to us." Now, back in their small house, Rachel and Michael waited for Ethan to return, both anxious but unsure of how to bridge the growing gap between them and their son. They didn't know yet that Ethan had taken matters into his own hands, determined to confront the man he blamed for their pain. They didn't know that their son's small act of courage would set off a chain of events none of them could have imagined. Soon enough, though, Rachel realized what Ethan was up to and showed up soon after, pulling him away from Victor. But when she looked up to Victor Crane's shocked face, she knew the damage was done, and that Ethan's intervention had done some damage. Victor sat in his office, staring at the skyline through the massive glass windows. Normally, the view invigorated him, a daily reminder of the empire he'd built. Today, it offered no solace. Ethan Parker's voice still echoed in his mind, cutting through the usual noise of his thoughts. It was a rare moment of stillness in Victor's otherwise meticulously controlled life, and he found himself uncomfortably adrift. He had spent the morning trying to refocus on work, but his attempts had been futile. The Parker family lingered like a shadow over every task. When his assistant, Claire, entered the office with the day's agenda, she immediately noticed his distraction. "You seem off today," Claire remarked, setting a tablet down on his desk. She had worked for Victor long enough to sense when something was troubling him. Victor sighed, running a hand through his neatly combed hair. "It's nothing. Just a kid at the gala last night said something that got under my skin." Claire raised an eyebrow. "That's rare. What did he say?" Victor hesitated, unsure why he was even sharing this. "He blamed me for ruining his family. His dad ran some small company we sued into the ground years ago. It's probably nothing, but—" He trailed off, shaking his head as if to dismiss the thought. Claire tilted her head, studying him. "That's not nothing. What are you going to do about it?" Victor scoffed lightly. "What do you expect me to do? Go back and rewrite history? It's business. I don't have the luxury of dwelling on every competitor we've outmaneuvered." Claire didn't respond immediately, but her silence was pointed. She placed her hands on the back of the chair across from him and leaned slightly forward. "Business isn't just numbers, Victor. It's people. You might want to think about what winning actually costs, not just for others, but for you." Her words landed harder than Victor expected, and she stepped out of the room before he could respond. He leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of her observation settle over him. For years, he had operated on the belief that his actions were justified by the success they brought. Now, he wasn't so sure. Victor picked up his tablet and opened a search engine. Typing Parker Innovations. He sifted through old articles and legal records. The details of the case resurfaced easily, an airtight patent dispute that had dismantled Michael Parker's small tech firm. He found a more recent article buried under the search results. Once promising innovator faces hard times. The article detailed Michael's failed attempts to relaunch his career, noting that his reputation had taken a significant hit after the lawsuit. It mentioned Rachel Parker's efforts to keep their family afloat and a brief sentence about their financial struggles, including an impending eviction. Victor closed the tablet and rubbed his temples. Guilt gnawed at him, foreign and unwelcome. He was used to viewing his victories as clear-cut successes, but the faces of Ethan, Rachel, and Michael complicated the picture. The next morning, Victor called Claire into his office. She entered briskly, holding a notepad. "What's on the agenda?" she asked. "Clear my afternoon," Victor said, his voice firm but distracted. "I have something personal to take care of." Claire blinked, surprised. "Personal? Should I be worried?" "No," Victor said quickly. "Just trust me." Claire gave him a curious look but nodded. "All right. But you'll owe me an explanation later." Victor spent the rest of the morning immersed in his usual meetings, but his thoughts were elsewhere. By the time he stepped into the back seat of his car that afternoon, he had resolved to see the Parker's situation for himself. He gave his driver the address he had found during his research and leaned back as the car made its way across the city. The Parker neighborhood was a stark contrast to Victor's world. The streets were lined with modest houses, many showing signs of neglect, peeling paint, overgrown lawns, and faded shutters. His car drew a few curious looks as it pulled to a stop near the address he had given. Victor got out and walked slowly down the street, his footsteps feeling out of place on the cracked pavement. He spotted the house easily. It was small and unassuming, with a worn porch and a "for rent" sign sticking out of the overgrown grass. A pang of guilt hit him as he realized what the sign meant. The eviction notice he had read about was more than just words. He saw Rachel Parker first, stepping out of the house with a bag slung over her shoulder. She glanced around briefly, her face weary but focused. As she walked toward a beat-up car parked in the driveway, Victor stepped back into the shadow of a tree, not wanting to be seen. She paused by the car, resting her head against the door for a moment before getting in. Victor felt like an intruder, witnessing a moment of vulnerability he had no right to see. The car sputtered to life, and Rachel drove off, leaving Victor standing on the sidewalk. He hesitated for a long moment before approaching the house. Through the window, he caught a glimpse of Michael sitting at a table, staring at a laptop with his head in his hands. The man looked older than his years, his shoulders slumped with the weight of defeat. A part of Victor wanted to knock on the door, to explain himself, but he couldn't summon the courage. Instead, he turned and walked away, his chest tight with an unfamiliar mix of emotions. Guilt, pity, regret, they churned together, making it hard to breathe. Victor didn't return to his office after leaving the neighborhood. He instructed his driver to take him home, where he spent the evening in silence, replaying what he had seen. Rachel's tired face, Michael's defeated posture, the cracked windows and faded paint of their home, it was all seared into his memory. For the first time in his life, Victor Crane wondered if success was worth the destruction it left behind. He had always thought of himself as a man who built things, but now he saw the ruins his empire had created. That night, as he lay awake in the dark, Victor made a decision. He didn't know exactly what he could do to fix the damage he had caused, but he knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. Ethan Parker's voice still echoed in his mind, and Victor resolved to find a way to silence it, not by forgetting, but by making things right. Victor's mind churned as he sat in his home office, staring blankly at the reports on his desk. The images from his visit to the Parker neighborhood haunted him, the peeling paint on their house, Rachel's weary expression, Michael's slumped posture. They weren't just names on an old case file anymore. They were people he had impacted in ways he hadn't fully understood until now. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. Fixing this wasn't as simple as writing a check. It had to be more meaningful, more lasting. But how? He had spent decades focused on profits and strategies, not on the human cost of his decisions. Frustrated, Victor decided to step out of his penthouse. The silence of his luxurious surroundings had become oppressive, a constant reminder of the distance between his life and the one he had seen in the Parkers' neighborhood. He put on a plain jacket, hoping to blend in, and walked aimlessly through the bustling streets of the city. It was early evening, and the streets were alive with the hum of activity. Restaurants were filling with customers, delivery drivers darted in and out of buildings, and the air smelled faintly of car exhaust and fried food. Victor stopped near a small diner to watch the world pass by. A delivery driver parked a battered car in front of the diner, stepping out with a bag of food. He recognized her immediately, Rachel Parker. She didn't see him as she adjusted her bag and walked briskly toward the entrance. Her hair was pulled into a hasty ponytail, and her uniform was slightly wrinkled. Victor felt a pang of guilt as he watched her. This was the same woman who, just a few years ago, had likely been planning family vacations or dreaming about the next big step in her husband's business. Now, she was delivering food to make ends meet. Without thinking, Victor followed her into the diner. He wasn't sure what he hoped to achieve, he only knew he needed to talk to her. The smell of greasy burgers and fresh coffee hit him as he stepped inside. Rachel stood at the counter, waiting to pick up another order. "Excuse me," he said, approaching her cautiously. Rachel turned, her expression wary but polite. "Yes?" Victor hesitated, then extended a hand. "I think we may have met before." Rachel frowned, clearly not recognizing him without his formal business suit he always wore. "I don't think so. Sorry." Her voice was polite but distant, the kind of tone she likely reserved for customers or strangers. Victor felt an odd mix of relief and guilt that she didn't recognize him. "I'm sorry," he said, stepping back slightly. "I might have been mistaken. You just looked familiar." Rachel gave a tight smile, clearly eager to end the interaction. "No problem. Have a good evening." Before she could leave, Victor blurted, "Do you work here often?" She paused, raising an eyebrow. "Not here, exactly. I do deliveries for a few places." "Why?" Victor hesitated, then shrugged. "Just curious. It seems like a tough job." Rachel's expression softened slightly, though her eyes remained guarded. "It's not easy," she admitted. But you do what you have to do, right? When you have a family to take care of, you can't afford to complain. Victor nodded, unsure of how to respond. He was struck by the quiet strength in her voice, the determination that seemed to carry her even in the face of overwhelming odds. Sometimes it feels like the world's stacked against you, though, Rachel continued, almost to herself. Especially when people with all the money and power don't think twice about the lives they ruin. Victor's chest tightened. He knew her words weren't aimed at him specifically, she still didn't know who he was, but they felt like a direct hit. That sounds unfair, he said quietly. Like there's no way to fight back. Rachel shrugged, her tired smile tinged with bitterness. It's not fair. But what's the alternative? You give up, and then what? My husband, he's still trying to figure that out. But I can't wait around for him to pick himself up. We've got a son to think about. Victor's throat tightened at the mention of Ethan. That sounds hard, he said. It was a weak response, and he hated himself for it. Rachel sighed, glancing at the counter where another bag of food was waiting for her. Hard doesn't matter. You just keep going. That's what being a parent is, right? You do whatever it takes. Victor felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Admiration, perhaps, mixed with a deep sense of regret. Rachel had every reason to be angry, bitter, defeated, but instead, she was holding her family together with sheer force of will. He had spent his life building an empire, but what did he really know about resilience like hers? The server called Rachel's name, and she grabbed the bag, slinging it over her shoulder. Anyway, I should get going. Have a good night. Victor nodded, stepping aside as she left. He watched her walk out to her car and drive away, his mind racing. Rachel's words stayed with him long after she disappeared into the night. They weren't just about her family, they were about him, too. He had spent years chasing success, crushing anyone who stood in his way, and justifying it as the cost of doing business. But for what? Rachel's quiet determination and unyielding hope had shaken something loose in Victor. He had seen resilience before, but this was different. It wasn't about ambition or ego. It was about survival, about love, about fighting for something bigger than yourself. Victor walked home that night instead of taking a car. The city lights blurred around him as he replayed his brief conversation with Rachel. She didn't know who he was, but she had already taught him more than he cared to admit. He realized now that making amends wasn't just about fixing the damage he had done, it was about learning to see people as more than obstacles or assets. By the time he reached his penthouse, Victor knew he couldn't ignore the Parkers anymore. Rachel's strength and Ethan's courage had sparked something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of responsibility. He didn't know exactly how to help them, but he was determined to find a way. Victor hadn't been able to shake the impact of his brief encounter with Rachel. Her resilience, her quiet strength, and the undercurrent of pain in her words lingered with him. For days, he replayed their conversation in his mind, thinking about what it must take to keep going when the odds felt insurmountable. But it was Ethan who occupied Victor's thoughts the most. The boy's tearful accusation at the gala haunted him like an unfinished sentence, a reminder that there were no clean victories. What did a child that young know of lawsuits and business strategies? Yet, somehow, Ethan had seen through all the layers of justification Victor had built around his choices. That was what finally drove Victor back to the Parker neighborhood. It was late afternoon when he arrived, the autumn sun casting long shadows over the modest street. He parked his car a block away this time, unwilling to draw attention. Walking the familiar route toward the Parker house, he felt a strange mix of apprehension and determination. This wasn't about business anymore. It wasn't even about guilt. It was about seeing the Parkers as people, something he had failed to do when it mattered most. As he approached the house, he saw Ethan sitting on the front steps, a battered soccer ball at his feet. The boy looked up when he noticed Victor, his small face hardening into something that resembled defiance. Victor stopped a few feet away, unsure how to start. "You," Ethan said, his voice sharp and unyielding. "What are you doing here?" Victor took a deep breath. "I wanted to talk to you." Ethan stood, gripping the soccer ball tightly. His eyes narrowed, his expression far too serious for a child his age. Why? So you can say it wasn't your fault? That you didn't mean to ruin our lives? The rawness of the boy's words hit Victor like a physical blow. He crouched slightly, trying to meet Ethan at eye level. No, he said softly. I'm not here to make excuses. Ethan didn't look convinced. Then why are you here? You already took everything from us. What more do you want? Victor hesitated, struggling to find the right words. He had spent a lifetime speaking in boardrooms and negotiating deals, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for this conversation. I'm here because I think I made a mistake, he said finally. And I don't know how to make it right. Ethan's grip on the soccer ball loosened slightly, though his expression remained guarded. Why do you care now? You didn't care when you were doing it. Victor nodded, accepting the boy's accusation. You're right. I didn't care back then. I told myself it was just business, that it didn't matter who got hurt as long as I won. But seeing you, your mom, your dad, I can't ignore it anymore. Ethan stared at him for a long moment, his young mind working through Victor's words. Finally, he sat back down on the steps, his small shoulders slumping. We used to be happy, he said quietly. My dad used to laugh a lot. Now he just sits inside all day. My mom works all the time, and we're gonna lose our house. It's not fair. Victor sat down on the edge of the sidewalk, giving the boy space. You're right, he said again. It's not fair. Ethan glanced at him, his eyes wary but curious. Then why did you do it? Why did you have to win so bad? Victor let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of the question. Because I thought winning was all that mattered. I thought if I could be the best, make the most money, then I'd be successful. But I didn't think about what that kind of winning costs other people. Or myself. Ethan looked down at the soccer ball, turning it over in his hands. You don't look very happy, he said after a moment. You're rich, but you look sad. Victor blinked, surprised by the boy's observation. It was uncomfortably accurate. Maybe that's because I'm starting to realize I've been doing things the wrong way. Ethan tilted his head, studying Victor. You can't just say sorry and fix it, you know. Victor nodded, appreciating the boy's honesty. I know. That's why I'm here, to figure out what I can do. I can't undo what happened, but I want to try to make things better. The front door creaked open, and Rachel stepped out, her eyes widening in surprise when she saw Victor. Ethan? She said, her voice cautious as she approached. Who's this? Ethan stood and walked over to his mother, his voice steady but tinged with anger. It's him, Mom. The man from the gala. The one who made us lose the company. Rachel froze, her eyes narrowing as they locked on Victor. What are you doing here? She asked, her tone cold and defensive. Victor stood slowly, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. I came to talk, he said. I wanted to see if there's any way I can help. Rachel let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Help? After what you've done? You think you can just show up here and fix everything with a check or some grand gesture? Victor shook his head. I don't think that. I know I can't undo the damage I've caused. But I want to try to make amends. Not because it's easy, but because it's the right thing to do. Rachel crossed her arms, her posture tense. You've got a lot of nerve showing up here. I know, Victor said simply. And I don't expect you to forgive me. But I couldn't keep pretending this didn't matter. Ethan tugged at his mom's sleeve. Mom, he said he made a mistake. Maybe he means it. Rachel looked down at her son, her expression softening for a moment before she turned back to Victor. You've already taken so much from us. What could you possibly do to make it better? Victor hesitated, the weight of her question hanging between them. I don't know yet, he admitted. But I'm willing to listen. To start there. Rachel studied him, her eyes searching for sincerity. After a long pause, she exhaled and placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. You want to help? Prove it. But don't think for a second that we'll make it easy for you. Victor nodded, grateful for even the smallest chance. "Thank you," he said, meaning it. As he left the Parker house, Victor felt the beginnings of a plan forming in his mind. It wouldn't be simple, and it wouldn't erase the past, but it was a start. For the first time in years, he felt like he was walking towards something real, something that mattered. Victor spent the next few days carefully considering his next move. The conversation with Ethan and Rachel had been a start, but he knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. He needed to act, and more importantly, he needed to do it in a way that felt genuine, not like a hollow attempt to soothe his conscience. One morning, Victor asked Claire to set up a meeting. He wanted to speak with Michael and Rachel directly, this time with full transparency about who he was and what he hoped to do. Claire raised an eyebrow when he explained the situation, but she didn't question him. She simply nodded and said, "I'll make the call." By the afternoon, Claire had arranged for Victor to meet the Parkers at a small, neutral venue, a quiet conference room in a local community center. It was far from the opulence Victor was used to, but that felt appropriate. This wasn't about power or prestige. It was about facing the consequences of his actions. When Victor arrived, he found Rachel and Michael already seated at the table. Rachel's posture was stiff, her expression guarded, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of curiosity. Michael, on the other hand, sat with his arms crossed, his face a mask of bitterness. Ethan was absent this time, and Victor silently thanked Rachel for sparing the boy from what he anticipated would be a difficult conversation. Victor took a deep breath and sat down across from them. For a moment, no one spoke. The tension in the room was palpable, like a taut string ready to snap. "Thank you for coming," Victor began, his voice steady but earnest. "I know you didn't have to." Michael scoffed. "You're right. We didn't." Rachel shot Michael a look, but Victor held up a hand. "It's okay," he said. "I understand why you're angry. That's part of why I wanted to meet with you. I owe you both an apology." Michael's eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward slightly. "An apology? That's rich coming from you. Do you have any idea what we've been through because of you?" Victor nodded, meeting Michael's gaze. "I don't claim to understand all of it. But I've seen enough to know that my actions hurt you and your family deeply. At the time, I justified it as just business. I told myself it wasn't personal, that it was the price of competition. But that wasn't the whole truth. It was personal for you, and I ignored that." Michael let out a bitter laugh. "You ignored it because you didn't care. You were too busy winning to think about the people you were destroying." Rachel placed a hand on Michael's arm, trying to calm him, but he shook her off. "No, Rachel. He needs to hear this." Michael turned back to Victor, his voice rising. "Do you know what it's like to sit across from your son and watch him cry because you can't give him the life he deserves? To see your wife working herself to exhaustion because you've failed? I built that company from nothing. It was my dream, my way of providing for my family. And you crushed it without a second thought." Victor didn't flinch under Michael's tirade. He let the man's words wash over him, absorbing the weight of his anger and pain. When Michael finally leaned back in his chair, his chest heaving, Victor spoke softly. "You're right," he said. "I didn't think about what it would cost you. And I can't undo the damage I've done. But I can try to help you rebuild." Michael's eyes narrowed again, though his anger seemed to waver. "Help us? Why? To make yourself feel better?" "No," Victor replied firmly. "This isn't about me. It's about you. About your family. I don't expect you to forgive me, and I don't deserve it. But I believe in what you built, Michael. And I want to help you get back on your feet." Rachel, who had remained mostly silent until now, leaned forward slightly. "What exactly are you offering?" Victor glanced at both of them, choosing his words carefully. "I want to help you rebuild your business. Not as an investor or a partner, but as someone who believes in your vision. I have resources, connections, and experience that could make a difference. I'm willing to mentor you, provide funding, and open doors that were closed to you before." Michael stared at him, his expression a mixture of disbelief and suspicion. Why would you do that? What's in it for you? Victor hesitated, then said, Because it's the right thing to do. And because I've seen what your family has gone through, and I can't stand by and do nothing. Rachel looked at Michael, her brow furrowed in thought. It's not an easy decision, she said softly. We've been burned before. Michael clenched his jaw, his eyes still locked on Victor. How do we know we can trust you? How do we know this isn't just another way for you to come out on top? You don't, Victor admitted. And I don't blame you for being cautious. All I can do is show you that I'm serious. Let me help, and if at any point you feel like I'm not living up to my word, you can walk away. No strings attached. Michael leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed again. He didn't speak, but Rachel placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentler this time. Maybe, she said, her voice measured. This is a chance we need to take. For Ethan. For us. Michael closed his eyes briefly, then sighed. Fine. But if I even get a hint that you're trying to manipulate us, this is over. Victor nodded, relieved but not celebratory. He knew this was only the beginning. Thank you, he said. I won't let you down. As the meeting ended, Victor watched the Parkers leave, their steps hesitant but their heads held high. For the first time in a long while, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Hope. This wasn't just about redemption, it was about doing something that mattered. Something real. Victor spent the days following his meeting with the Parkers immersed in action. He wasn't one to make promises lightly, and if he was going to earn their trust, he knew his efforts had to speak louder than words. The first step was funding. He transferred an initial amount into an account for the Parkers, enough to stabilize their immediate needs and provide a foundation for their business. But he didn't stop there. He reached out to his network, making calls to suppliers, potential clients, and even former colleagues of Michael's. Some were surprised to hear from him, especially when he made it clear that he wasn't asking for anything for himself but for the Parkers. Others were skeptical, questioning his motives, but Victor didn't care. He had a mission now, and nothing would deter him. Meanwhile, Rachel and Michael cautiously began to rebuild. Michael, though still burdened by the weight of past failures, found a glimmer of the passion he once had. He started sketching ideas for new designs, concepts he had shelved long ago when the stress of keeping his company afloat had consumed him. Rachel, ever practical, helped organize the logistics, ensuring they used the funds wisely. Ethan, sensing the change in the air, spent his evenings drawing pictures of what he imagined the company's new office would look like. But trust didn't come easily. Michael, in particular, remained wary of Victor's intentions. He scrutinized every move, every offer, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. During one meeting to discuss potential suppliers, he couldn't hold back any longer. Why are you really doing this? Michael asked, his tone edged with suspicion. Is this just some PR stunt? A way to ease your guilt? Victor met his gaze steadily. I won't deny that guilt played a part in this, he admitted. But this isn't about my reputation or easing my conscience. It's about doing what I should have done years ago, seeing people as more than obstacles. Michael leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, clearly not fully convinced. But before he could respond, Rachel interjected. I think we have to give him a chance, Michael, she said, her voice firm but gentle. Not for his sake, for ours. We can't keep looking back. We need to move forward. Michael looked between his wife and Victor, then exhaled heavily. Fine. But I'm not going to let my guard down. Not yet. Victor nodded, understanding. That's fair. I don't expect trust overnight. As the weeks went on, progress became visible. With Victor's resources and connections, the Parkers secured a small office space in a shared work hub. The walls were bare, and the furniture was second-hand, but it was theirs. Michael's designs began to take shape, attracting interest from a handful of investors who respected his innovative approach. Rachel managed the operations with efficiency and a level of optimism that hadn't been present in years. Ethan, however, remained Victor's toughest critic. The boy's initial awe at seeing the new office was quickly replaced by skepticism. He often asked questions that cut to the core of Victor's motives, his young mind unrelenting in its pursuit of the truth. One day, as Victor visited the office to discuss potential partnerships, Ethan approached him, arms crossed. "You're helping now, but why didn't you care before? You only care because you feel bad." Victor crouched down to meet Ethan's eye level. "You're right," he said. "I didn't care before, and that was wrong. But sometimes, when people realize they've made a mistake, they try to fix it. That's what I'm doing now." Ethan stared at him for a long moment, then said, "Mom says everyone deserves a second chance. But if you mess up again, you don't get a third one." Victor smiled, humbled by the boy's honesty. "Fair enough. I'll do my best not to mess up." Despite lingering doubts, the collaboration began to feel like a partnership. Victor didn't just provide financial support, he also offered mentorship. He spent hours coaching Michael on pitching to investors and refining his business plan. Though Michael bristled at first, he eventually admitted, grudgingly, that Victor's advice was valuable. But it wasn't just the Parkers who were changing. Victor found himself transformed by the experience. For years, he had defined success by wealth and power, but seeing the Parkers rebuild something meaningful reminded him of what he had lost: purpose. It was no longer about erasing his guilt but about building something real alongside people who cared deeply about what they were creating. Inspired by this newfound perspective, Victor decided to expand his efforts beyond the Parkers. He launched a foundation dedicated to supporting small businesses like Parker Innovations, companies with vision but limited resources. The foundation provided funding, mentorship, and networking opportunities, aiming to level the playing field in an increasingly corporate-driven world. For Victor, it wasn't just atonement, it was a way to use his power for something good. Months later, as the Parkers officially relaunched their business, the atmosphere was one of cautious celebration. Investors had come on board, and new contracts were already in motion. The family was still healing, still learning to trust, but they had hope again. Victor attended the launch quietly, staying in the background. He watched as Michael presented their vision to a room full of supporters, his voice steady and confident. Rachel stood beside him, her smile bright despite the exhaustion etched into her features. And Ethan, now a little taller, handed out flyers with a pride that made Victor's chest tighten. As the event wound down, Ethan approached Victor, holding one of the flyers. He held it out, and Victor took it, smiling. "Mom says you helped a lot," Ethan said, his tone still guarded but less accusing. "She said you deserve a second chance." Victor crouched down, meeting Ethan's gaze. "What do you think?" Ethan hesitated, then shrugged. "I think you're trying. And I guess that's a start." Victor chuckled softly. "I'll take that." As the boy ran off to join his parents, Victor stood and looked around the room. It wasn't the culmination of his redemption, he knew there was still work to be done. But it was a moment of renewal, a chance to build a legacy that wasn't just about wealth or power but about making things right. For the first time in years, Victor felt something he had forgotten existed: peace. And as the Parkers stood together, their faces alight with hope, he realized that they weren't the only ones moving forward. So was he. And so, Victor Crane's journey reminds us of a powerful truth: no one is beyond redemption, and even the smallest acts of courage can create waves of change. What began as a young boy's tearful confrontation grew into something far greater, a story of accountability, second chances, and the rediscovery of humanity. Through Ethan's bravery, Rachel's unwavering determination, and Michael's willingness to rebuild, Victor learned that true success isn't measured by wealth or power but by the lives we impact and the legacies we leave behind. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear how it touched you. Don't forget to like this video if it inspired you and subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us of the beauty and complexity of the human experience. Together, let's celebrate the power of transformation and the hope that lives in every second chance. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.